Hello and welcome to this special meeting of the Eureka City Council this Tuesday, November 19th. Can we have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Castellano,
Here.
Councilmember Moulton,
Here.
Councilmember Fernandez is absent, Councilmember Bauer,
Here.
Councilmember Contreras Deloche,
Here.
Mayor Burgell.
Here. Public comment pursuant to the Brown Act, Section 54954.3A. The public shall be provided an opportunity to speak only on items that are listed on this special meeting agenda pursuant to City Council Resolution 2011-22. City Council policy is to limit each speaker to 3 minutes. Such time allotment or portion thereof shall not be transferred to other speakers. And with that, we will have a presentation from Director Kenyon.
Hey, good evening. Let me share my. We also have consultant Ben Noble on Zoom, and he's going to be doing the second half of the presentation. I'm doing the first half. Oh.
My what?
It's okay. So this is the second presentation in our three-part series on neighborhood character. Part one, in September, we had Gaurav Srivastava from Dudek talk about the past with a focus on the history and legacy of single-family zoning. And this presentation is about the present, and the final presentation in December will be about the future. You saw this in the last presentation. In 1966, that's when the city of Eureka adopted a comprehensive zoning code, and we added a lot of regulations and standards that at the time were considered modern best practices, like large minimum lot sizes and large off-street parking and yard space requirements, but that ended up presenting large barriers to adaptive reuse and infill, and are therefore one of the root causes of our current lack of housing supply and diversity. This 1966 zoning code also introduced subjective design review to the city. That was focused on the exterior design of structures, and the subjective standard was that the ugly, the inharmonious, the monotonous, and the hazardous shall be barred, but originality in architecture, site planning, and landscape and graphic design shall not be suppressed. And what I want to highlight here is that Eureka has had subjective design review now since 1966. And when we previously talked about design review, this development on Hillsdale Street got brought up as something that doesn't fit with the character of the neighborhood. And I wanted to point out that, this and the other examples that got brought up, they all were built post subjective design review. Like, they all got subjective design review approval. I'm not saying that subjective design review is the reason they don't fit in with the neighborhood. I'm just saying that it didn't help stop this from happening. All the other houses were constructed not only before design review, but before zoning altogether. And we really love them. So that's humbling as a planner. Anyway, in 2019, we did this great inland zoning code update where we comprehensively fixed our code and removed and reduced a lot of these restrictive standards that were getting in the way of the adaptive reuse and infill. And our new code also added a bunch of objective design standards, but it kept subjective design review. It continues to require it. It's still focused on the aesthetics. We've honed in on the fact that it's the exterior street-facing facades of buildings that are really the most important thing. And there's a number of standards, but there's what's replaced the harmonious standard is that the overall project and associated buildings enhance the design quality of the area where they are located and enhance Eureka's unique character and distinctive sense of place. New buildings may fit in with traditional architecture or stand out. And what the presentation today is asking is, what developments enhance the design quality of an area and fit in and are harmonious with the setting, and, why? So the presentation concludes that it's not about the number of dwelling units, and it's not about a particular architectural style. There are certain site and building elements that are present across architectural styles and across different types of, multifamily and single family homes that are characteristic of well-designed development. And Ben's going to talk about that. The first part of the presentation, I'm going to focus on this, about how it's not about the number of dwelling units. And what I'm going to talk about is middle housing. So what is middle housing? Middle housing is defined as a range of house scale buildings with more than one dwelling unit that are compatible in scale and form with detached single family homes. And they help meet the growing demand for walkable urban living. This is a diagram from the consulting firm Opticos, where it shows detached single family homes on one end of the spectrum and apartment buildings on the other end, with middle housing in between. And the diagram calls it missing middle because it rarely gets built anymore. For many decades now, the housing development industry has just been focused on the two ends of this spectrum, leaving Americans with just two options, and one of which, single-family homes, are becoming unaffordable and therefore unattainable for a larger and larger segment of our society. So what is so great about middle housing? It can be more affordable by design. Their smaller units and smaller lots can result in development that is market rate affordable to more people without subsidies or deed restrictions. It also adds housing diversity that can support different incomes and generational needs. And it allows for more density, which is needed to support things like transit. Transit can't be viable with one home on each 6,000 square foot lot. That's not enough density to support transit. Same with creating a customer base to have neighborhood serving businesses that you can walk to. And because the building footprints and overall scale are comparable to single family homes, even though they can add a lot more density, they don't necessarily feel like it's super dense. It has a lower perceived density. It also, this is really critical in Eureka, where we have this very old and awesome building stock, is that it allows for adaptive reuse. So by allowing people potentially to add more units to an old mansion, you're incentivizing the retention and maintenance of historic structures. So where am I? The last presentation, we went over the history of zoning in Eureka. Before zoning, so before 1953, many different types of housing were built in single neighborhoods, and they formed coherent, beautiful neighborhoods that established Eureka's distinctive sense of place. And modern zoning became a barrier to the production of middle housing because of those things I talked about, like large lot size require minimum lot size and parking, but also we literally banned it. We said single family only over 78% of our residentially zoned land. And this study from UC Berkeley is really cool. I suggest people check it out. They looked at 519 California cities and counties, and our percentage of single family zoning is actually the average in California. R1 averages 78% of residential land in California, and the median is 84%. And there's a bunch of jurisdictions where over 90% of their land is zoned single-family residential. But in Eureka, we do have really great examples of historic missing middle housing in our older neighborhoods, and we also have newer examples in the areas zoned for multifamily housing, which are shown in blue here. And also all of our commercial districts are mixed-use districts. So we allow and encourage housing in all of our commercial districts, which is another place where we get modern-day middle housing. And I'm going to quickly go over some of the quintessential middle housing typologies. Middle housing can take a variety of forms and different types can blend into each other, but as a way to organize the discussion, I'm just going to break this down so I can highlight some of the ones we have locally. First, we got the side-by-side duplex, 2 units attached at the middle. This is one of my favorites. These 2 that are side-by-side in Eureka, these are 2 duplexes. On California. This one's in the Bridge District. It's smaller than a typical single-family home. 2 units there. This one, 2-story, side-by-side duplex. You got the stacked duplex, where you have 1 unit on top of the other. This is one on I Street. What did I want to say about? We just have so many great examples of duplexes. That enhance the character of the neighborhoods they are in. There's this one, you really, the only, they're indistinguishable from surrounding single family homes other than maybe like they have 2 doors. Moving up in density, we have the 4-plex, which is like the stacked 4-plex, 2 dwelling units on the ground floor and 2 above with shared or individual entries from the street. This type has the appearance of a medium-sized single-unit house. Also, it allows, you could fit it on a typical 50-foot wide lot, and you could even, if you have an alley, which Eureka is blessed to have. I know living on an alley, it doesn't feel like a blessing always, but that would allow you to have even parking for each unit in the back. And we have classic examples of stacked 4-plexes in Eureka, and a lot on H Street where they fit right in with the stately big homes. Next is my personal favorite, the cottage court or bungalow court. It's comprised of little bungalows arranged around a shared courtyard that is oriented towards the street. Back when these were popular in the 1920s, the courtyards were often framed on the backside by a 2-story structure. But if the lot is on an alley, the rear of the courtyard can also function as parking. We have a few examples. I couldn't find exactly when this was constructed, but it was sometime between 1920 and 1949. This one happened after 49, but before 55. This one, the units are attached to each other. Now that we have a more car-centric culture, you often see a side court instead of the landscape courtyard in the middle. You have a driveway on the side with to access the individual garages. This orientation allows for multiple units on a narrow lot. There is 1 unit with a prominent entrance facing the street with the other units tucked behind so that it looks and feels like a single family home when you're walking down the street. The units can be attached or detached. Similarly, there's the motor court, but in this case, you've got the access down the center. And so when you're walking by on the street, it feels like a single family home and then an alley and then another single family home, but you have a bunch of density tucked behind. Townhomes. These are single unit structures placed side by side and attached to each other. Each unit has an entry on its street facing facade. Each unit can be its own individual lot sold separately, which could be prohibited by modern zoning codes if you require side setbacks. Here is an example from Eureka. This is the first example I'm showing you that happened post-1966 and therefore actually got design review approval. Multiplexes are detached structures that are 2 to 3 stories and consist of 5 to 12 dwelling units, typically with a shared entry from the street. This type has the appearance of a large single-unit house. In Eureka, we have many multiplexes that look just like single-family homes because they were, in fact, large single-family homes at one time and have been broken into a number of units. I added the side pictures because that's where you begin to see the added density that isn't immediately obvious from the front. The last type I'm going to mention is live work, where you have one dwelling unit above or behind a fire-separated flexible ground floor space that can accommodate a range of non-residential uses. The flex space and residential unit typically have separated street entrances, and the flex space typically has a taller height and a shop front frontage. Here's an old corner store example from a residential neighborhood in Eureka. So I talked about some of the benefits of missing middle, and conversely, I just want to talk about some of the costs of not allowing incremental density. You end up with a lack of diversity of housing stock, and there's definitely a gap in supply and demand for walkable urban living and access to transit. I'm not saying that people don't love having a big house and yard, but they would also really love to be able to walk to a coffee shop. There's also a gap between supply and demand for smaller units. As we know, we have an aging population. Also, 31.4% of Humboldt County households are one-person households. That's nearly a third of households in Humboldt County. 78% of Eureka households are without children. So really, we have quite a few people that maybe don't need a 6,000 square foot lot, and maybe don't want that. We also, by not allowing for this incremental density and allowing our neighborhoods to adapt and grow, this has led to an overall deficit in housing supply, which is driving up costs for everyone in the market, with over 40% of Humboldt County households cost burdened, meaning they're spending more than 30% of their income on their housing costs, which is really bad for our economy because then they don't have as much discretionary spending for those coffee shops I keep bringing up. So, and really, like this, I found online, and look at how little housing we've built, in recent decades. So what is this, getting back to the point of the presentation, I'm almost done, I'm passing it on to Ben. What does this tell us about context-sensitive development? I think we have great examples of how, multi-unit structures can be incorporated seamlessly into a single-family neighborhood. And so I don't think it's the number of units that determines whether development contributes positively. And it's really about how that development behaves in the context that it's in. And that's what Ben's going to talk about. So I'd like to pass it over to Ben. Derek, can you unmute Ben?
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. So again, my name is Ben Noble. I am a city planning consultant assisting Eureka with the design review topic. Next slide, please. All right, so Kristen asked me to talk about some of the elements of building and site design that contributes to context-sensitive development within this middle housing context. So I'm going to talk about a number of important design features related to site design and building design and other site features with some photographic examples of recent middle housing construction. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first subject is building placement. So where buildings are located on the lot. So here's an example of townhome style development where units are placed near the street to support a pedestrian-oriented public realm. Now, there's a lot of other units that, if you go back, please, there are a lot of other units that are included in this development, but the units that are closest to the street are relatively close with a direct connection between the sidewalk and the primary entry of each of those units. Next slide, please. So here's another example of this is, I think, a triplex that's located within a neighborhood that consists primarily of larger historic single-family homes. And you can see here the architecture of this building is relatively contemporary, but it's placed on the lot in a manner that's similar to the other homes in the neighborhood in order to reinforce that existing neighborhood character, even though the architectural style is a little bit different. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're talking about building orientation, which is a fancy way to refer to where the entrance is located in the building relative to the street and other things that are on the site. And this is an example of a recent motor court development in Santa Cruz County, where there's about 12 units, and you can see that there are some N units that are closest to the front of the lot where the street is, and the entry to those units are oriented towards the street rather than towards the interior of the lot. And what that does is that helps to create a more attractive and welcoming streetscape character for pedestrians that are walking by. Next slide, please. Here's an example of a similar type of motor court development where you can see that there's a drive aisle between each side of buildings. There's, I think, 6 units that were part of this development within a predominantly single-family neighborhood. And the primary entry to those N units that are nearest to the street are facing the sidewalk and connected to the sidewalk to support a more cohesive neighborhood and to facilitate social interaction. Next slide, please. Okay, so in addition to entry orientation, we can also think about entry design. And here is a fourplex that was recently constructed in Fortuna in Humboldt County. And you can see that there are 4 entries that are facing the street, and each of those entries has either a porch or an awning or some other architectural element that emphasizes the entry. And that helps this building to read as 4 units of house scale rather than one large building that may appear out of scale with the surrounding neighborhood. And if you look closely, you can actually see a resident sitting on the porch, and you can imagine that person waving as you walk by. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's an example of a affordable senior housing development in Fort Bragg in Mendocino County. And these units are all oriented towards an interior courtyard, but each of the units incorporates a little patio, covered patio area with a low fence, and this helps to create a transition from more public spaces to private spaces. And this is a good example of how affordable housing development can incorporate some relatively simple design features that really improves the way that it performs. Next slide, please. Okay, so now talking a little bit about parking placement and design. So as Kristen mentioned, in our more auto-centric world that we live in now, a lot of new development, including middle housing development, is designed to incorporate on-site parking and parking garage. And the design of that parking is really, really important for the success of that project. So we think about parking placement and design on the lot. And here's an example of on-site parking is accessed from the street, but the garage doors face the side. You can't really see it from the street, and that does a lot to enhance the quality of the pedestrian environment. Next slide, please. Sometimes it is necessary for garages to face the street, and in those cases, there are things that we can do to minimize the visual prominence of those garages. We can limit the width of the garage doors, or we can require those garage doors to be set back a little bit from the front of the building in order to reduce the visual prominence of those garages and help to reinforce a pedestrian-oriented environment. Next slide, please. Okay, now building massing. So the volume of a building, whether it's one large block or if it's divided into smaller masses. Here's an example of recent construction where there's 4 units on this particular site, and it's divided into 2 main volumes. And the massing of those volumes, despite the fact that they contain 2 units, are more similar to the volume that you would expect to see with a single-family home. Next slide, please. Another thing that we think about is if there's a more intensive use that's introduced into a neighborhood, how can the larger mass sensitively transition to adjacent lower intensity uses? And one of the ways that that can happen is by gradually stepping the height and the mass down from the, in this case, commercial street frontage to the adjacent single-family residential uses. And you can also see in this photograph that some of the architectural details, including exterior materials and roof forms, also change as this building transitions to the adjacent single-family use. Next slide, please. Okay, so in addition to site design and building massing, we can also think about some of the design details of the building facade. Here's an example of a very recent townhome development in Santa Cruz County, where there's a variety of facade features that create articulation and help to break up the building massing. So you can see variation in window forms. You can see changes in exterior colors and exterior materials. You can see other design details like some Juliet balconies, as well as some functional balconies and some modulation in the building plane. And all of that helps to break up the massing and to contribute to a more human scale design. Next slide, please. And sometimes you don't have to have a lot of design features. Sometimes just a few things is all that you need, particularly with a more contemporary design. In this example of recent side court development in the Bay Area, you have variation in exterior color and materials combined with some modulation that does a lot to create visual interest consistent with the more contemporary design of the building. Next slide, please. Okay, roof design often is very important, particularly when we're increasing height, maybe beyond what is familiar in a particular neighborhood, and introducing some varied roof forms can help reduce the box-like appearance of a building, particularly with more contemporary designs. Next slide, please. And here another example of recent construction where there's just a simple break in the roof line to create visual interest, produces a far superior design than if there is one continuous roof line. Next slide, please. Okay, open space, very important as a resident amenity, as well as for the design of a project and how well it fits into its context. So here's an example of some shared open space with amenities that promote social interaction. I think this is very well designed, where it's a sufficient width, and it includes a lot of amenities for residents that creates a very appealing place set in the redwoods. I can imagine myself bringing a cup of coffee and a little book to read and really enjoying spending some time outdoors in the sun in this kind of a space. Next slide, please. The open space can be designed so that windows and doors of the units are facing that space to create a sense of security, to enhance security, and to activate the space so it's attractive and welcoming for residents. And in this example, you can see there are a lot of amenities such as benches, trash cans, pedestrian scale lighting that enhance the quality of that space. Next slide, please. Landscaping, of course, is very important. Here's an example of a 2-unit project in Santa Cruz County where I think because of some site constraints that the building massing really needed to be located relatively close to sidewalks that were fairly narrow to begin with, and to soften that building edge, some landscaping was installed between the property line and that building to add greenery to the urban streetscape. Next slide, please. And then landscaping also can be very important for the quality of the resident open space with interior landscaping that's incorporated, that's integrated into the resident amenities, as is the case in this cluster development in the San Francisco Bay Area. Next slide, please. Okay, and then there are a lot of individual or small details with site feature that collectively can make a big difference in the compatibility of this sort of infill development within an existing neighborhood. So here's an example of a side court project in Santa Cruz County where you can see on the right is an enclosure for trash receptacles, and the design of that enclosure includes the materials and other architectural details that match the primary residence. So you almost don't even notice this in the photograph. Next slide, please. And then other details such as front landscaping, fence design, lighting as well can enhance the visual character of the public realm. Next slide, please. Okay, so those were a collection of photographs of recent middle housing construction and some of the more important design elements that helped those projects be successful and fit into an existing neighborhood that's primarily single family in its character. And all of these different design elements work together to create projects that fit into their context and respect the existing character regardless of their architectural style. So you saw examples of more traditional architecture as well as some more contemporary architectural styles and how those projects were successful despite that variation in design. So when thinking about standards for infill residential development and middle housing, the good standards don't necessarily prescribe exactly how the buildings will look, but really will focus on how they behave to enhance the neighborhood quality and support a pedestrian-friendly environment. So with that, I will hand it back to Kristen for some concluding remarks.
Yeah, I think Ben made the good conclusions there. Our next presentation, we're going to be talking about how we can basically create objective design standards around some of these things that we talked about this time that promote good design. And that's it for us.
Great. So thank you so much for the presentation. So currently it is 5:36 and we have some time before our next meeting. So I want to let folks know the timing where we're at, but we're happy to take questions or comments in the moment if you have any, or direction. Councilmember Contreras-Deloche.
Mayor, before we do that, Councilmember Fernandez has joined us. And so Councilmember Fernandez, could you just let us know why you're joining via Zoom?
I'm at a conference related to city council.
Okay, thank you.
Great. So in order for Councilmember Fernandez to participate in the meeting, we will have to have a motion and a second and vote.
I move for Councilmember Fernandez to participate in tonight's special meeting.
I second, remotely, yeah.
So
I'll second.
both meetings?
Oh, can we do both meetings now?
I believe so, right? Yes.
Double
Sure.
second.
Okay, I motion for Councilmember Fernandez to participate in the special meeting and the regularly scheduled council meeting.
Thank you. So that's a motion and a second. Please vote.
Unanimous yes vote, motion carries.
Thank you. Councilmember Contreras Deloche?
So I know we don't have a lot of time and I don't want to belabor it, but this is something where I think I would love to kind of come and talk with you more and learn a little bit more about this more than what we can do right now. But I am curious and I'm grateful that the next presentation is going to kind of explain how what we just learned can be implemented, because the whole time we were going through this, I was thinking, okay, during the 2 years that I've been on council, there's been a lot of pushback for any of this kind of stuff because it's subjective. And so I'm really interested to find out how those two things can go together. And pardon my voice, I'm just getting it back. So I do have a question though. I guess I'm curious. So specifically about the massing, and it was talking about kind of doing like step down and stuff like that. There a California law that says you can't request anything that's going to reduce the density of a project that's planned? Because wouldn't stepping it down do that?
Yeah, we had this conversation. I remember it's the Housing Crisis Act, and basically, if we're adding new standards that reduce the ability to reduce density somewhere, we can't do that unless we're also increasing density elsewhere at the same time. But I don't know if a step down we'd have to analyze whatever. If we do want to add new objective standards, we're going to have to analyze them and how they affect density. Yeah. And then, but we could be potentially adding other standards at the same time that allow for increased density in other ways, and it would balance itself out.
Okay, thank you. I also wanted to, I was born and raised here and have, generations of family that's here. And I think, I don't necessarily see a nefarious purpose behind there being single family housing. I think it reflected the values of the time, which was that people were all trying to own a home. And I think a lot of people still are trying to do that. But we have, a different set of circumstances and we have different needs. And I think it's okay for us to be, and important for us to be adapting that quickly. But I think also too, a lot of the development you see around growth periods. So in the 50s and 60s, we got a lot of houses here because there was a lot of growth. We didn't see a lot of buildings in the 70s because there wasn't a whole lot of growth. And then between 80 and 90, we experienced a bunch of growth again. And that's when we got all those garage houses, I like to call them, where it's basically they're very, went a massive garage with like a house on the back, and that's also, I believe, when the kind of dog complex that I had mentioned in my neighborhood that faces funny, and it looks very kind of out of character. I appreciate too, looking through these pictures, almost all of the examples here locally are either in my ward or like within blocks of my house. And I think there are tons of really good examples of that, of how we can do fourplexes, eightplexes, sixplexes, duplexes. We have cottage courts and that's what they're called, right? Those cute little cottage things. Yeah. So I think there's lots of good ways we can do it. I am very interested in doing this because